Welcome to this special noontime talk at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. For those of you who don't know, I'm the chair of the CMES, and I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of you here today for this very interesting and, of course, very timely talk. And I'm very, very happy to have with us here the journalist and academic Şahin Alpay. We're so pleased to have Dr. Alpay with us today. It's really quite an honor. This is our first collaboration with the Pacifica Institute, and I'm sure many of you here know about the work of the Pacifica Institute, which is, of course, a West Coast interfaith cultural organization that hosts a number of programs around the Bay Area and beyond. So we can thank the Pacifica Institute for bringing Dr. Alpay here to Turkey today, from Turkey to Berkeley today, and in particular, I'd like to thank the Pacifica Institute's executive director, Fatih Ateş, who has been a familiar face at the CMES in the past. I'm now going to ask Fatih to say a few words about our esteemed guests. Please welcome them both to Berkeley.
Thank you. Thank you to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and especially I'm thankful to Lydia to making this event happen. So I am, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Lydia. So I am the director of the actually San Francisco and the East Bay area, not the whole institute.
I gave you a promotion.
Thank you.
He deserves it.
Thank you. So it's really honored to have the Dr. Şahin Alpay here today, and so he is a columnist for the Turkish newspapers Zaman and the Today Zaman in Turkey, and he previously served as editor and the columnist at other leading Turkish dailies newspaper Cumhuriyet, Sabah, and Milliyet. Dr. Alpay received a PhD in the political science from Stockholm University and held a faculty position in the Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul until his retirement in early 2015. His comments on Turkish domestic politics and the foreign policy frequently appear in the international media as well. So I'm honored to introduce Dr. Alpay here today. So please help me welcome to him here.
Well, I'll begin by thanking, of course, the Middle Eastern Studies Department. I'm so happy that together with Pacifica Institute, they're providing me with this opportunity to share with you my understanding of what is going on in Turkey right now and engage in a conversation with you so that I also learn from you people. I'll thank particularly to Professor Gottrich, Emily Gottrich, and Lydia for helping organize this event. I'm so happy that I have this opportunity. Now, I think I'm going to sit unless I find it uncomfortable. Anyway, you know, Turkey is a country full of contradictions and contrasts. One of the most recent remarkable contrasts is that we have a government in charge who started out perfectly, almost perfectly, got the support of the major part of society. His party was able to garner up to 50% of the votes in the elections in 2011, and actually until 2011, from 2002 when it came to power to 2011, it was really delivering much. Turkey became a much more free society, much more affluent society, and people in the West start to think of Turkey as being a model or a source of inspiration for the entire Muslim world, because the AKP government seemed to combine Islamic values with human rights, universal basic rights and freedoms. And I was very supportive. You see, I'm a liberal. Maybe I should make it clear what is my position. And by liberal, I mean political liberalism more than anything else. I am more of a social liberal or a liberal social democrat of the Swedish kind. I spent about 10 years in Sweden, and I believe those years in Sweden have made an impact together with other factors in shaping my current political position. In Turkey, between 2002 and 2011, there was great support for this party. But however, beginning in early 2011, we started receiving signals that this government perhaps wasn't any longer meaning to do what it promised to do. I remember, I was very, very much pro-AKP government because of various reforms it was leading. And I might have written now and then some critical column about its policies regarding the media, regarding environmental issues, and regarding maybe some foreign policy issues. But on the whole, I was very supportive, together with many other liberal-minded, let's say, public intellectuals in Turkey. But after the elections of 2011, we all started getting conflicting signals from particularly Mr. Erdogan. I remember writing my first critical column in February 2011. That's long before the elections, I believe, was in October in 2011. And the title of my column was, "Does Erdogan want to become another Putin?" Because Mr. Erdogan, having garnered 50% of the vote, this was to, of course, take place at the end of that year, after garnering 50% of the vote, and after concluding that he now has the military under political control. I'm sure you're aware that in Turkey, the military has played a major political role, intervening every 10 years or so and shaping the regime in accordance with its principles and interests. And even during those two initial terms in power of the AKP, Erdogan's party, there were attempts by the military to overthrow him. But thanks to great support from the people, those attempts were not successful. There was also an attempt by the public prosecutor to ban the party for, as usual, violating the secular principles of the republic, but with just a difference of one vote, the Constitutional Court decided against banning the party. Anyway, he felt himself, after the elections in 2011, I have 50% of half of the people behind me. I have the military under control, so I can do whatever I like with Turkey. And he said, if Turkey is going to become one of the 10 largest economies in the world by the year 2023, which coincides with the 100th anniversary of the Republic, I have to lead. I need a Turkey-style executive presidency form of government with little checks and balances, with power being concentrated in his own hands. So he started from then on taking an increasingly arbitrary, authoritarian, and we were to find out very, very corrupt way of governing the country. That year, 2011, was fateful for Turkey in other respects also, because remember that was the year when the so-called Arab Spring broke out. Until 2011, AKP's policy was our main goal in domestic politics is to do the reforms that are necessary for the country to join the European Union. And in foreign policy, their policies was summarized in the slogan, "Zero problems with neighbors." Zero problems with neighbors meant that Turkey would not use violence or threats of violence in its relations with the neighbors, in its disputes with the neighbors, and that the country, Turkey, would try to increase economic interdependence and with neighbors and try to solve problems through dialogue and diplomacy. And I was one of those who really applauded this policy of zero problems with neighbors. But unfortunately, the Arab Spring made Mr. Erdogan and his foreign minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu is the current prime minister right now, change their minds about zero problems with neighbors, thinking that Arab Spring would topple all the autocratic regimes in the Arab world and bring to power Muslim Brotherhood parties, which they had good relations with since a long time. They decided that we support Muslim Brotherhood parties, which are to democratize all these countries, and this will provide us with an important opportunity to become the leading country in the Middle East or in the Muslim Middle East. So they started to look away from the EU perspective. Of course, one may argue that the EU wasn't any longer really interested in, having Turkey exceed the European Union. That was also a factor, obviously. And he dumped the policy of ZPN. And what do we get instead? We get increasing authoritarianism, as already said. And this authoritarianism has increased by stages. The first stage came in the summer of 2013, when trees that were to be taken down in Taksim Square in Istanbul to build a shopping mall instead of the Taksim Park. Some people, especially the environmentalists, started to protest against this, and then these protests were joined by all different groups who had become increasingly wary of the authoritarian bend in Mr. Erdogan's policies. So it turned out to be a big, big event. What Erdogan did in response was, instead of trying to find out why do people complain, how can I address their problems, he came out and said, it is the foreign powers who do not appreciate Turkey getting richer and stronger, and they're providing these demonstrations against our government to dissuade and, if possible, to overthrow our government. And instead of taking lessons, he decided to suppress rather radically the demonstrations, which spread to almost entire country, with millions of young people demonstrating against his government. So that was the first episode. Many people got killed during the suppression of demonstrations. And then the second phase came at the end of that year, 2013, when public prosecutors in Istanbul disclosed the findings of a graft probe they had been pursuing for some time, showing that at least 4 government members, 4 ministers, plus some of the top bureaucrats of the AKP government were involved in perhaps the most serious corruption scandal ever in the history of the Republic, and they wanted to prosecute the concerned ministers. And actually the scandal also seemed to involve, if not himself directly personally, but his son, his elder son, who was a partner to some of these people involved in high corruption. So what was Erdogan's reaction? He said, this is fabrications. It has nothing to do with corruption or anything of the sort. It is the Gulen movement, the social movement inspired by Fethullah Gulen, or what we call the Hizmet movement. It is the Hizmet prosecutors and policemen belonging to the Hizmet movement who have conspired against us, just as they conspired against the military previously. You see, when there were 2 coup attempts by the military previously, one in 2003, one in 2007, and the military, who found themselves in defense, said that we've done nothing wrong. It's the Gülenists, this religious movement, who don't like us, who set up this conspiracy, this plot to accuse us of trying to overthrow the government. Of course, it's a complicated issue. If there are questions, I would like to go into the larger picture of these coup attempts and how they were prosecuted. There were problems with the prosecution, definitely. But anyway, by saying that it was the Gülenists who set up this conspiracy against the military, they're doing it to me too now, so that this was his way of trying to approach the military and trying to get the military on board with him. This is an interesting point because he's going to continue to pursue this policy of trying to appease the military, because I believe he's always been afraid of a Sisi scenario repeating itself in Turkey, and he has actually explicitly referred to this. My enemies want to see a Sisi-like military takeover in Turkey. Anyway, this was what followed was a total cover-up of the graft probe. Judges and prosecutors and policemen involved in the probe were all taken away from their offices. Actually, they were all thrown away from their positions. Some of them have since then been imprisoned, so that, and then of course, everything that had to do with the probe was declared to be unfounded, and we are as clean as possible. It is just foreign powers that are, together with the Gulen movement, conspiring against us. We have done nothing wrong, no corruption, no nothing. Powers who are envious of Turkey's growth and development want to set up these troubles for us. This was the second phase, and it also triggered a witch hunt against the Hizmet movement. You know, you're very familiar with McCarthyism in the United States in the 1950s. I think we've had the worst kind of McCarthyism in Turkey now since 2013. I mean, of course, some people in the Hizmet movement might have committed some crimes, some offenses, but how can you accuse the entire movement, and how can you try to prosecute a lot of people and put pressure on an entire civil society movement, which is extremely important, not only for Turkey's democratization and liberalization, but also extremely important from the point of view of the Muslim world in general. Gulen has put forward a very tolerant and liberal interpretation of Islam, which is, I believe, unheard of in any other part of the Muslim world. And he has turned a traditional religious movement into a social movement which has even globalized, has helped Turkey in education, in dialogue with the outer world, and it has also helped Turkey develop trade relations with an important part of the world. Now, if there are any questions about what I think about the Gulen movement, I'm very happy to respond to those questions. So this was the second phase. And in the second phase, another component was that he asked the big businessmen who get public tenders from the government to establish a fund, a pool of money to buy a substantial part of the Turkish media. So several big businessmen who are involved in, you know, building the airport, the bridges for Turkey, those big projects, they gave money, built a pool of money to buy half of the Turkish media, and that media is being used to, you know, spread lies and unfounded accusations against opposition of all kinds, and this is spreading. I mean, it was first the Gulenists, but now increasingly the target of the lies and how would you say, attacks against the opposition is spreading even to businessmen who are not favorable towards the government. So we're really experiencing an increasing authoritarianism by Erdogan government. But that did not stop there. June 7 elections was introduced, the third phase in growing authoritarianism of the Erdogan government. He's very keen on having public opinion polls. So when he saw from the polls that the pro-Kurdish party, HDP, who came out and said, we are never going to let you become an executive president, we'll stop that, which was, of course, a very important statement that has affected Turkish political scene very, very deeply. So apparently, Erdogan, one of his merits actually was he had started a dialogue, a confidential negotiation with Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, imprisoned on the island of İmralı. And to cut a long story short, this dialogue had been going on since 2006. He made it public at the end of 2012, and he said, we're going to resolve this problem of the Kurdish question in Turkey. And when, of course, HDP came out and seemed to contradict the deal he had reached behind the scenes with Öcalan, he started how to find ways how to avoid HDP's growing influence among the Kurds, because for the first time we had a pro-Kurdish party which was very strongly saying that we don't want violence from any side. We want a democratic Turkey. We do not want to separate from Turkey, but we would like to have our ethnic rights and autonomy in the region. We are in the majority, and not only autonomy for the Kurdish region, but a total decentralization of the highly centralized Turkish political system. And they started, of course, attracting the sympathy of not only growing number of Kurds who had been voting for AKP, and also an increasing part of the Turkish electorate also, because people realized that HDP was a very important opportunity for the country to stop Erdogan from winning enough seats in the June 7 elections to try to introduce the kind of Turkish-style presidentialism he was after. And that was exactly what happened. June 7 elections proved that 60% of the votes went to the opposition, 3 opposition parties, a pro-Turkish party, the main opposition party, Republican People's Party, which has been the main Kemalist party ever since the founding of the Republic, and then the HDP. HDP not only succeeded to surpass the 10% threshold introduced by the military in the 1980s, but it also succeeded in gaining 80 parliamentary seats, which of course made it a very important force in Turkish politics. Of course, HDP's presence meant that Erdogan's dreams of becoming an executive president were blown away, and even his party was no longer able to run the government single-handedly. So this was a big, big defeat for him. But he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. He first tried everything in his power to stop a coalition, an alternative coalition government built. And using his constitutional right to declare new election if a coalition government is not formed within 45 days, he decided that we're going to have, in his words, a repeat election to correct the mistakes of the Turkish electorate. Until then, he was saying that democracy is the will of the people. It is the elections which are the essence of democracy in order to, defend his positions, his majoritarian understanding of democracy. But anyway, this time he changed his mind and he said, we need to have a new election because this is the only way the country can regain stability. And he also said that since I am elected by the people as president in 2014, we have effectively, in practice, a presidential system, and I am the boss for all. And he even said that, Whether you like it or not, we have a presidential system. And that was, of course, what led to the fact that we are now going to have a new election in on November the 1st. Now, how long have I spoken? I'll say a few words about the prospects, and then we'll go over to your questions. What are the prospects? According to the polls who are close to, pollsters who are close to the opposition, they say he doesn't stand a chance. It is very likely that the pro-Kurdish party will not fall below the threshold. To the contrary, it is very likely to raise its share of the vote because more and more Kurds who formerly sympathized with Erdogan and voted for AKP are turning towards the HDP. Here, of course, I forgot to mention what has happened. He not only started denouncing the HDP as being an extension of the PKK, but he took several how would you say, opportunities to reignite the violence with the PKK. So it's been terrible since exactly July 20. I just read yesterday that 127 police officers and soldiers have been killed since July 20. And of course, we don't really know how many PKK militants have been killed. He said openly, we have so far killed 1,000 PKK fighters and we intend to kill many more. That's his position. He's going back to the 1990s when the military and an important part of the political establishment in Turkey was supporting a military solution to the Kurdish problem. I'm fully aware that you are aware what the Kurdish problem in Turkey is. It's not possible to solve the Kurdish problem in the way the military has defended over so many years. So it is we are now wondering whether the November 1 elections can be held in a stable environment, whether the violence between the PKK and the government is going to hinder sound election to be held. We're also wondering if Erdogan and his people are going to resort to extensive fraud with the polls. So we don't know about these things. But I have a sense that the people are once more going to reject him, because I can see that even his party is increasingly getting upset with his ways. One of his closest, one of the co-founders of the AKP, Bülent Arınç, just 2 days ago said, when we founded this party, we spoke about us. Nowadays, we spoke about me. And that was a rather clear signal from Arınç, who definitely is not voicing only his opinion, but an increasing number of AKP members. And then another sign is just few days ago, I think was on September 13, AKP had its general Congress. And Davutoğlu, the sitting prime minister, wanted to have some of the people on the steering board of the party, and Erdogan would not let this. He decided all the names who are going to be in the party leadership. And apparently, Davutoğlu and people close to him have complained to some journalist friends that they are not happy at all with the kind of interventions Erdogan is having on the party. So we may expect some sort of a rebellion from the ranks of the AKP. I don't know if this is wishful thinking, but many are expecting such a rebellion taking place. And the worst case scenario is, of course, that the military who he tries to enlist to his support may at one point decide that enough is enough and seize back the initiative it seems to have lost since some years now. So I would not exclude a Sisi-kind intervention, although it doesn't seem to be on the agenda right now. I think of course, why do I think so? The Turkish military is Kemalist, very hardline Kemalist. Let me conclude by saying what I understand by Kemalism, and then let me also say a few words about why this sea change in Erdogan and his government's policies. By Kemalism, I mean this authoritarian kind of modernization, meaning that we cannot modernize this country with democracy, so we have to have a single party government, if not a single party government, an authoritarian kind of government, which has been the case throughout the second half of the 20th century. Secondly, if we are going to have a modern Turkish state, then we cannot allow religious freedom. We have to take religion under state control and introduce restrictions on religious freedoms, because religion is an obstacle to modernization. And thirdly, we cannot allow recognize different identities. We all have to be Turks and we all have to speak Turkish. And that has been the basis of assimilationist policies, which were carried out. Maybe it was in early 90s that with Turgut Özal, the policies towards the Kurds began to get some sort of relaxation. But anyway, those policies are still in place. Some cosmetic measures have been taken to take away the restrictions on the expression of the Kurdish identity, but assimilationist policies are still in place. The school system is assimilationist. They deny the Kurds rights in education in mother tongue, etc. And now let me say a few words to conclude. Why the change in Erdogan? There are three theories which are being circulated in Turkey. One is the one put forward by the Kemalists. They say, you stupid liberals, we knew that this was his hidden agenda. As soon as he concentrated power in his own hands, as soon as he put away the military, he was going to put his Islamist agenda in practice. I doubt if this is the case. What sort of Islamism is it when the party for almost 10 years worked to, fulfill the Copenhagen political criteria of the European Union? What sort of Islamism is this when the party during its 2 terms helped improve basic rights and freedoms? So it's nonsense. It's total nonsense. Second theory that is being circulated, well, of course, Erdogan now in his second stage is making a demagogic use of Islamic values, of Ottomanism, of the glorious Ottoman heritage of Turkey, etc. But those are all to boost his greed for power and money. And he has built this party, which is, you know, just, I don't know how you call it in English, but it's a gathering of people with political and economic interests who support each other and who try to continue the power they have in their hands. Second theory, which I subscribe to, is simply power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, this has been the case. And yet there is another third theory, put forward mainly by psychologists and psychiatrists, who say the guy is crazy. There is some disorder in his personality that has broken out. Of course, all three theories, some say, can be valid at the same time. But the first theory I really do not find so convincing. Well, thank you so very much. I failed to thank you all for showing this interest and coming here today to be with us and engage in this conversation with me. Thank you most cordially. And now I'm ready for your any questions you may have, and for the Q&A period I'll stand up.
Do you want to, shall I call on people, or do you want to manage your own? I'll help you.
Yeah,
Please.
please do.
Thank you very much for your talk. In your reading of AKP term, you suggested specific periodization in which 2011 appears as a turning point or rupture for like illiberal, authoritarian, or oppressive policies. And I have a question about that periodization. And I also should say that I totally agree with you on the point that argument that Erdogan used to have this hidden Islamist agenda now he's putting in action. I totally agree with you in this point. But for instance, like how do you explain or analyze 2009, 2010 KCK operations in which thousands of Kurdish activists and elected politicians were arrested with baseless allegations? So yes, even if there was a rupture, aren't there continuities in that rupture? And more importantly, how do that continuities tell us in terms of our political analysis and also political projections?
Well, I don't know if I will be able to answer your question fully, but this problem with the PKK or KCK, their front, well, it's not a front organization, it's, how shall I describe it? It's an extension of the PKK. Now, Erdogan's approach to the Kurdish problem has been ill-founded from the beginning, because how can you solve the problem, which is the denial of the rights of the Kurdish people? What you needed, what we all liberal-minded public intellectuals wrote from the beginning, that you don't have to negotiate with the PKK to recognize the rights of the Kurds. Just go ahead and make a new constitution which defines the nation of Turkey as composed of citizens of this country, which all the Kurds accept. Secondly, go ahead and the Kurds recognize that the Kurds have the right to educate themselves in their mother tongue. It should be an open choice for our Kurdish citizens whether they would like to educate their children in their mother tongue or not. And thirdly, please, this country is over-centralized, decentralized. You know, all the pro-Kurdish parties have said, let's divide the country into 20 regions and grant autonomy to a certain extent to all of the different 20. We don't want it just for the Kurds alone. Now, this was what needed to be done to really solve the Kurdish problem. You see, I'm sure you're aware that about 15 to 20% of Turkey's population are Kurds. Millions, an estimation, 4 to 5 million citizens born out of mixed marriages, half Kurdish, half Turkish, and 60% of the Kurds live in the Western Turkish majority parts of the country. How can you divide, how can you separate the Kurds from the rest of the country? That would be a tragedy more bloody than what we saw in the former Yugoslavia context. Now, beginning here, of course, it was also necessary that you talk to the PKK, that it's not, you're not going to achieve anything by violence, neither are we to achieve anything, so let's sit together and find a way of putting a stop to this violence. We are ready to legalize the PKK. We are ready to declare a general amnesty that would clear the way for all PKK militants to come home and engage in democratic, peaceful politics. This should have been the sound policy, but he didn't do it this way. He instructed his intelligence chief to deal with Öcalan on a deal which appears to be, to us, who try to observe these developments closely, let the Kurds support me in my Turkish-style presidency, and the first thing I'm going to do is to release you from prison and maybe, you know, even come with other concessions. I mean, this may be a too, how would you say, blunt portrayal of the kind of deal that might have been being worked out. But anyway, when the HDP comes out and says, we're not going to let you become the executive president, he went berserk. And his people started saying, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to discredit great leader Öcalan, who is the great, you know, Erdogan's people were saying that Öcalan is one of the greatest leaders of the Middle East. What are you doing? Are you discrediting the great leader Öcalan? And one of them were saying, if Öcalan was around, he would chase you with a stick and things like that, you know. So, but here is another point I would like to make. HDP is a new phenomenon. And now all his efforts are directed towards destroying this new Kurdish option. Try to solve the problem by democratic, peaceful, non-violent ways. And the PKK, of course, may not be so happy with this. There are increasing signs that the PKK leadership up in the Kandil Mountains is quite unhappy with what the HDP, represented by Selahattin Demirtas, a very talented young Kurdish, I think he's a lawyer by profession, and he's doing a wonderful job. And how wonderful he is, I'll try to explain by what I heard from a shopkeeper in my hometown, Ayvalık, which is the westernmost town, meaning that it's furthest away from the Kurds. The shopkeeper told me during the June 1 elections, Mr. Alpay, if Demirtas could come out and say, I have nothing to do with the PKK or the Öcalan, then the entire country would follow his leadership, he said. So he's found so convincing by a large portion of the population. Now, a final word about your KCK detentions. It apparently was about a period when there seems to be the deal between the intelligence chief and Öcalan weren't going so soundly. But what he says, Erdogan says, it's not us, it's the Gülenists who did this. Nothing of the sort. It's Erdogan who has been who has taken under control the entire police force and the judiciary, which was definitely behind all these detentions and imprisonments.
Professor Tugay?
Thanks for your talk. I agree that 2011 is a big turning point, but I'll expand on that list. There were a lot of authoritarian things going on before 2011 too. It was not just anti-KCK. There were many anti-environmentalist actions against the environmentalists. There was a lot of authoritarianism against the workers' movement, and there was a cleansing of the state from Alevi minority Muslim cadres. And the worst of all is that a lot of liberal intellectuals actually stood behind these actions because they said, some of these people, the Alevis, the workers, the environmentalists in Hopar, they are in cahoots with the military. So it's good that the government is cracking upon them. And what really happened after 2011, the fourth theory that you didn't mention, is that the soft totalitarian mechanism that had been perfected against these groups, against the workers, student movement, environmentalists, and the Alevi minority, then it was directed against Gülen and the liberals after 2011. But it was in the making and it was being supported by the liberals. Not because the government was Islamist, but because this is, theoretically, this is in the interest of liberal democracy to crush the enemies of liberal democracy.
I fully agree with you, and I'm glad that you brought up the Alevi question, which is so central to understanding what is going on in Turkey. Alevis, as most of you may know, is the largest religious minority. Alevis say that, part of them say that we are part of Islam, the third sect after Sunni and Shi'i Islam, and that it is Sunni Islam is to Arabs, Shia Islam is to Persians, and Alevism is to Turks. This is part of the Alevi population's position, and the rest say we have nothing to do with Islam. We are a religion, a creed, religious creed on our own. And Alevis have been suppressed. They have a, how would you say, a dilemma. They find themselves in a dilemma against the Kemalist state because they think that strict secularism of Kemalism protected them against Sunni domination. But on the other hand, the fact that the Kemalists even denied the existence of Alevism, did not recognize their religious rights, is the other side of the coin. And since early 1990s, Alevis have started to organize, to criticize and demand that their religious identity is recognized by the Turkish state. Erdogan has done nothing of the sort. The Alevi shrines, places of worship, are still not recognized as such. And can you imagine, Turkey is, a country, so-called secular country, where there is no right to, how would you say, different religious groups have no right to have, what is the term now, legal personality. So, for example, the Gulen movement in a normally democratic society would be able to, if it so wished, to have a legal personality. It's not allowed. Alevis aren't recognized. Non-Muslim and even the Sufi religious tarikats, and which have been banned ever since 1925, have no legal personality. So this is very authoritarian kind of secularism we have. And now Kemalists used it to suppress Islam, and now Erdogan is using the same system to work for Sunni domination and suppression of people who find themselves in minority in religious affairs. And Alevis are definitely one of the groups who are really upset with what Erdogan is doing. You know, in his first two periods, terms of power, he said he even flirted with the Alevis. He held, I think, something like 7, as they called, workshops with Alevi representatives to find a solution, to find the answer to the demands put forward by the Alevi community. But then he forgot about it as soon as he had 50% of the vote in the elections of 2011. So, and some of the very stiff opposition to Erdogan comes from the Alevis, definitely. And if Turkey is ever going to democratize, the new constitution has to deal with religious rights at large, and including the rights of the Alevis, of course.
Yes, what game is that I'm playing vis-a-vis the ISIS people? So first, he's allowing the recruits to come through the porous borders. Then he says, oh, we're going to make a deal with the United States. We'll deal with ISIS, and we'll give the United States bases to attack them. And so what is he playing there in terms of Syria, in terms of ISIS, in terms of the United States and this whole geopolitics?
Thank you so very much for raising this question, because it's, of course, a very important question. Now, until April 2011, Erdogan was on very good terms with Bashar Assad. I mean, personal friend, they would visit each other with their family. And, it looked like Syria and Turkey had left behind all the various disputes they've had over the years. But when the people started to demonstrate against Bashar Assad, Erdogan and Davutoğlu actually quite sincerely tried to convince Bashar Assad that this cannot continue like this. You have to open up your regime, you have to recognize basic rights and freedoms of your people. And I think Davutoğlu is right to say that he made maybe 7 trips to Damascus to try to convince Bashar Assad. But as you know, Bashar Assad, relying on the Iranians and on the Russians, of course, refused to do anything of the sort. Instead, started attacking the peaceful demonstrations began to be attacked by the government forces. And at that moment, Erdogan government decided to open up the borders of Turkey for Syrians who wanted to flee from this increasingly chaotic situation. And the end result is, of course, we now have close to 2 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey, some of them, as you know, trying to escape to the west, and we all know about that part of the story. But what happened next was, when Erdogan and Davutoglu were unable to convince Bashar Assad to reform, they wanted to strike some sort of an international coalition with American leadership to intervene against Bashar Assad regime. And the American government, Obama government, was giving signals that maybe they were ready to undertake such an intervention. He first said, Bashar Assad has to step aside, as you remember. And then after a while he said, we have red lines. If Bashar Assad uses chemical weapons, we're not going to tolerate that. And then so forth. And nothing of the sort happened. And Ankara, of course, rightfully thinking that it cannot intervene alone because, you know, that would be terrible, would have terrible consequences for Turkey, decided that they could discreetly, undercover, provide help to extremist Islamist elements, al-Nusra and what was to become ISIS, so that they would topple the government of Bashar Assad. They've always denied that they had anything to do in terms of helping these groups, but you know, Western press, and I think it was John Kerry, who openly said that we know that Ankara has provided certain help to al-Nusra front, if not directly to ISIS, and there are reports that ISIS has been selling oil to Turkey to support itself. So this is the tragic situation now, but there is another episode to this story, and this is, of course, the Americans were putting pressure on Ankara, saying that if you are not going to act against ISIS, at least let us use the bases. And this was until July, middle of July, that Ankara denied to let the Americans to use the bases. But when finally they said, okay, you're free to use the bases, but we are now confronted with three kinds of terrorism, not only ISIS, not only the PKK, but we are also confronted with Marxist terrorism, and we're going to fight on all three fronts. So he started bombing Kandil, and that is the reason why he's proud of having killed thousands and thousands of PKK militants. So, you know, some people suspect that he has used the cover of providing the Americans the basis to attack the Kurds because PKK is, according to the State Department, a terrorist organization, so nobody can dispute that fact. But of course, there's also another side to the story, and that side of the story is the Syrian Kurds. Erdogan was very clever during the times of zero problems with neighbors, build good relations with northern Iraq. the Kurds of Iraq, the autonomous Kurdish region of Iraq. That was, you know, he went against the military, against the traditional establishment in Ankara, because he understood that this would be a great idea. It would be new markets for Turkish goods. It would be Kurdish oil. Turkey needs so badly, you know, Turkey doesn't have any oil or gas, natural gas. We import 60% of our energy needs from Russia and 20% from Iran. So without taking into consideration those facts, you cannot really understand Russia-Turkey and Russia-Iran relations. Now the Syrian Kurds, of course, who have been terribly oppressed by the Assad regime, have not sided with any of the parties. They did not accept Ankara's pressure to join the fight against the Bashar Assad regime. They said, we don't want to be part of this uprising. We just want to, for once in history, to try to gain some sort of autonomy and independence in our own countries. And now, whereas Erdogan was so favorable towards having good relations with the Iraqi Kurds, he's turned against the Syrian Kurds and saying, we are not going to tolerate any Kurdish state in near our southern border. And one theory is, of course, that he has been rather appeasing toward the ISIS, is that ISIS is fighting against the Kurds, which happen to be the best allies of the United States at the time. So it's a very complicated picture.
We have time for one last question. I want to see your hands raised on this.
With all this going on, how has it affected the, with the increasing authoritarianism, how has it affected the Turkish economy? And how is that playing out politically within the country, if indeed, as I'm suspecting, the economy is suffering from this?
Very good question, of course, because during the first 2 terms of power, when the country was so stable, seemed to, approach fulfilling the EU criteria, there were direct foreign investments pouring into the country, in unheard of figures at the time. And that was partly because of the trust of rule of law in Turkey. But since 2011, since growing suspicion of the situation of the rule of law in Turkey, investments have started to fall, and even some of the already invested foreign capital is fleeing the country. And again, in this context, opposition from within the ranks of the AKP is heard in this context. The former economy minister, sitting finance minister, says that our economy is going to suffer badly if we do not see to it that rule of law is exercised in this country. So, of course, the economy is going backwards. We already have, I don't know how much, the value of the dollar was something like 2.6 liras just a couple of months ago. Today it's over 3 liras, so we have substantial inflation. I've seen that even unemployment figures have started to rise, and this is not going to have it's going to have terrible consequences for the economy also.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your visit, and please invite everybody to come and have a cup of coffee and stick around for a while. Thank you so much.